I really wanted to kind of confront and interrogate Nietzsche's aphorism because it meant so much to me for a long time. Mm-hmm. You know, especially as I mentioned in the book, in my youth, in my adolescence, in my 20s, in the first few years after being diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, it was something that was a real source of empowerment, of like maybe the romance of self-aggrandizement.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Again, I'm Sally Halderson, Managing Director at Porchlight Book Company. Both Boswell and Porchlight are located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we are somewhat sister companies in the sense that we both started out as part of the Harry W. Schwartz bookshops. And we specialize in bulk book sales, and Boswell, of course, is a wonderful independent bookstore here in the city. Let's turn this over to our topic and our book for tonight. Mike Mariani has worked as an English professor and freelance journalist, writing feature articles and essays for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Believer, Slate, and more. In What Doesn't Kill Us Makes Us, Mike Mariani challenges our acceptance and casual use of Nietzsche's well-worn aphorism, so often trotted out in the face of hardship: what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. He counters with a deep look at the multi-layered effects that trauma and tragedy cause, and shows that while, yes, strength can be one of the many hard-earned results of weathering a catastrophic storm, trauma or tragedy actually causes a rupture in our timelines, creating an afterlife in which our very identities are fundamentally changed. Mike, before we start, I want to thank you for this book. I related very personally to the material, and I come at it as someone who objectively has survived a number of traumas over my life, including, like you, the death of my mother at a young age. But a more relevant example to this book is that my husband was diagnosed with acute leukemia at 47. And while a stem cell transplant saved his life, he's not the person he was before his illness. And so this book speaks directly to his experience and mine as his spouse. And so I'm thrilled to have this chance to talk to you about a book that I think is so important. And I think that so many people are going to share with loved ones who might be going through more than sometimes we think we can handle. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate those personal connections that you drew. That means a lot.
I'm hoping that you will start us out with a bit of reading to introduce those who have not had a chance to read the book. You have a few pages that you're willing to read, or a section?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
So this is, just to contextualize it really quickly, this is from the introduction. I'm kind of looking back on a therapy session that I had a few years ago that sort of caused me to think very differently about my life, about my self-image, about how I conceptualized my identity. Mm-hmm. As I contemplated my constellation, I began to lose confidence in Nietzsche's aphorism. If my own tribulations had given rise to these attributes, then why wasn't that relationship illustrated more clearly in the wider world? I became skeptical of how Nietzsche's claim could be reconciled with all of the world's illness, physical disability, or even adverse childhood experiences, ACEs in medical parlance, that often presage difficult adult lives. I also had trouble squaring the idea that calamities strengthen us with the growing body of evidence demonstrating how trauma negatively affects the brain. It seemed highly possible that Nietzsche's words were, at their heart, quixotic and even irrational. I sensed that those trials that bend us to the point of breaking don't actually make us stronger. Or if they do, it is an elusive, qualified strength, one that hardly exists in the vacuum that the timeless adage suggests. But if tragedy and trauma don't make us stronger, I needed to know how they do change us. My conviction was unraveling, and in its place was a question that seemed as pressing and vital as any I'd ever come across. When you peeled away the rhetorical romance and the rousing apothegms, how did catastrophes change people's lives and identities? How does a person go about reconstructing their existence in the wake of calamity after much of it has been irretrievably lost? What do those whose lives have been knocked off their orbits have in common? How do we make sense of and find meaning in a life where suffering and misfortune go uncompensated? These are questions that, one way or another, affect us all. If I was going to relinquish my certitude that the central crucibles of my life had forged me into a fiercer, more persevering person, then I needed to find another perspective to take its place. Though I could not put words to it at the time, ever since I was a child contemplating my mother, both as an emotional presence and a physical absence, a cachet of memories in a void new ones would never fill, I felt compelled to redeem tragedy and loss with meaning. I did not want to merely accept her passing and shuffle along in my newly bereft state. Her loss needed to represent something beyond the rueful fact of itself. I believed that her death and the life it cut short needed to sculpt and shape me, to birth a way of seeing the world and living in it that I could sheath myself in for many years to come. If the tragedy of her death could transform me in some way into a stronger or deeper person, someone more impassioned or less willing to comfortably vanish into the scenery of the status quo, then everything we lost as a mother and son would not be in vain. That urge to scrabble some existential saving grace from hardship and deprivation has stayed with me to this day. I was fully aware of the scientific research on the subject, the statistical realities of how traumatic events and other catastrophes could erode a person's quality of life, attenuating their avenues of pleasure and envenoming their prospects for the future. But I also knew that that was not my story, or at least it represented only a single finite layer of it. I saw how much nuance and depth studies on trauma miss when we convert them into a catch-all framework for how calamities shape the rest of our lives. The only story statistics told was one of unqualified loss. I wanted to examine the gray areas of life after catastrophe, those vast, befogged borderlands that could not be neatly mapped out by the existing instruments at our disposal. I wanted to know how a person's dreams changed after she was paralyzed, lost her sight, or was sentenced to a decade in prison. Was the transition creeping and delicate, like moseying into consciousness on a Sunday morning? Or was it as savage and abrupt as a midnight assault? I wondered how a person's relationship with joy changed following an event that irreversibly robbed him of the chief avenues through which he once drew pleasure. I envisioned, in part based on my own experience, an intricate period of adaptation, a long private reckoning with those vacuums, conspicuous as the ghostly outlines in a room stripped of its furniture, followed by a private odyssey in search of what might replace them. I suspected that there might be some kind of pattern to the aspects of our lives that were lost forever and the means we undertook to discover what would take their place.
Thank you for reading that. There were some lines in there. I've mentioned this a few times throughout the questions that I have sketched out here, that there are some lines in this book that just give me chills. And I think that some of the ways that you phrase loss and reinvention are really critical to how we might reframe our own experiences. And I think that this book is a wonderful contribution to people who are finding themselves in periods of seeking and in struggle. And I think it shines a light on what is so often hidden, which is life after catastrophe, as you said. You write, I'm going to quote you, enduring catastrophe is in some ways the least understood, most deliberately overlooked rite of passage we have. It is the fulcrum of a relationship so simultaneously urgent and timeless that we have been grappling with it ceaselessly since antiquity, the one between tragedy and identity. And that cooperation between tragedy and identity is something that you pull through as a thread throughout the book. And I'm wondering if you would introduce us to some of these concepts in the book: tragedy, identity, afterlives, invisible kingdoms is another phrase that I think is beautiful. Catalog of losses, I think, is another really beautiful phrase that serve as a foundation for your approach to this book. Yeah,
absolutely. I think, well, just to start with invisible kingdoms, as I delved into the reporting for this book, it seemed like there was kind of an inexhaustible amount of potential catastrophic life events that cleave people's lives into a before and after. Whether it was, the loss of a child, serious disabling chronic illness, amputation, blindness, the various forms of disability. There were just so many different ways that a person's life could be cleaved into a before and an after. And to me, it felt like, this was this massive sprawling population of human beings, in the US and elsewhere that you really don't see in media. One of the things, one of the touch points that I remember thinking about over and over as I was kind of conceptualizing the book is how, when it comes to traditional media and journalism, tragedy is looked at immediately after it happens. We look at school shootings in the immediate aftermath. Things like that. We focus on the event itself and the hours and days afterward. And so, these lives are really kind of marginalized and overshadowed and kind of pushed under the rug. And so to me, it just felt natural to conceptualize them as these invisible kingdoms, these places where millions of people reside and grapple with these extreme crucibles, but they do so in a way where they're really not visible to mainstream culture and society.
Because you've experienced a loss of health due to chronic fatigue syndrome, which you weave into the reporting in this book, it might surprise people to know that this book is not a memoir. Even from the part of the introduction that you read, which does focus on when you sort of the spark of this idea. But it's a book of narrative reporting in which you weave your own story, your own catalog of losses, to use that phrase again, with the stories of 6 other people who have experienced catastrophe. And with their stories as guides, you examine their afterlives, that stark bifurcation between before and after. So how did you come to decide whose stories to feature in the book and what they came to mean to you as you told their stories? I guess in conjunction with your own.
Right. So I definitely interviewed, a substantial amount of people in the kind of the early stages.
Like 150, you said, I think?
Yeah, it was about 150. And like I kind of mentioned in the last response, it was a really broad swath of catastrophic life events, from blindness to amputation to paralysis to incarceration to the loss of a child, other significant illnesses, trauma, PTSD, different types of assault. And in terms of winnowing that large kind of that wide net that I cast, I think I approached it in 2 different ways. So one, I wanted to find subjects or interviewees that had a really clear-cut before and after, where it wasn't something that kind of took place very gradually, that was like really sharp and that kind of cleaved their lives into really discrete chapters. So I would say Valerie, JR, and Sophie qualify as those types of subjects. They're people who, in this case, they were in car accidents that completely, reformed their lives right away. It was sort of an immediate bifurcation or cleaving of their lives. So that was one thing I was interested in. These immediate not transformations, but these immediate changes. And the other subjects, Gina Appleby, for example, who is a woman based in South Carolina who really has endured a lot. She's kind of a more multifaceted example of somebody who's faced catastrophe, because she's faced multiple, serious adversities over the course of her life. So I guess I was looking for a blend of people who had really clear-cut single before and after experiences, and those who had sort of more multifaceted, more layered lives that maybe complicated what it means to have an afterlife.
Right. We'll dig into some of the individual threads that you connect between those stories as we go on. But I'd like to back up to something you mentioned in your first response, and a note that I took here about you focused essentially this group of stories on people who live in North America. And in particular, the majority live in the United States. And I'd like to talk a little bit about American exceptionalism, because I think the society within which we live defines how we learn to treat trauma. Our country has a chronic addiction to happiness and the desire for immortality. And much of the time, the definition of a well-lived life is one of material success and material contribution in a really expected kind of manner. But there are such systemic disadvantages for people who experience disability, which is far more common than one wants to accept. I think when we all stop and think about the fact that age, even if you've had a fairly harmless arc over the time of your life, like age brings disability for the majority of people. And so why would you say, and I think you touch on this throughout the book, that society persists in this false narrative of individuality and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and which is AKA being strong. And you call it a preservation of our absolutes that hides that which many of us do or will experience.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely said a lot there. And I agree that I think part of what I wanted to do with this book is sort of challenge that myth of American exceptionalism and the myth of kind of rugged individualism and being able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and kind of survive and persevere and triumph. Mm-hmm. Because to me, once you get beneath or go beyond these kind of homogenous American narratives, you do see that there are, a great deal of lives, whether it's through incarceration or disability or various other catastrophic events, where people are not able to, to thrive in that type of way. And yes, I think that the idea of absolutes is definitely an important one here. I think, going back to what I was saying in terms of like media and pop culture, a lot of what we see, in television and movies and in some cases in fiction, a lot of the narratives we're exposed to show people that are healthy, that are able-bodied, and that are able to basically live a continuous life that is not permanently ruptured.
Right.
And that's kind of our always category, the idea that we're always going to be living a certain type of life. And that sort of, there's a contract or an implication that type of life will never be violated. Mm-hmm. In this book, I really wanted to interrogate and sort of investigate what I term the never category, which is basically the type of lives that a lot of people never imagined they could possibly find themselves in. And I do think, it feeds into American exceptionalism, and it sort of helps us to imagine our lives in a certain way when we, create those two different categories, and we put certain lives in the never category and certain lives in the always category. That's kind of a neat way of perpetuating individualism and exceptionalism and ensuring that sort of the overarching, longstanding American narratives are not, too seriously challenged. Because, the type of lives in this book and the type of lives that we put in the never category, I think do present a really significant challenge to a lot of the narratives that we tell ourselves about, like, kind of like you were saying, like success, triumph, kind of continuing to accumulate more and more over the course of our lives, self-aggrandizement, all of these concepts that we kind of are pushed to subscribe to, are not how all of our lives are going to play out. And so, yeah, and just investigating this never category to me is a way of challenging those beliefs and convictions.
I think there's question about value too, right? Like when those of us who have had that cleaving, that separation between before and after, then are faced with what after is. And if we can't perform in a way that is conventionally contributing to society, meeting the expectations, whether it's, mobility to cognitive ability to actually being able to take care of another person, contributing to capitalism, all of those things, that I think that adds a secondary burden to surviving the catastrophe, is then saying, well, what am I of value if I can't be all the things that society is telling me that I should be in order to be successful? So let's talk about the title of the book. And I think there's a lot of weight that comes in the title of the book. And since I won't give away the end of the book, there is a callback to it in the final lines that I think is really important too. But you take on the Nietzschean aphorism, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And in the title of the book, you eliminate the word stronger. And that serves to emphasize the makes us, right? The shapes us, the influence of what happens then results in the person that we become, and takes away the focus on the value of strength alone. So I'm going to read a couple of lines here that I've picked out that you wrote. Individuals leading afterlives are almost always stronger than they were before their catastrophes because their altered circumstances require them to be. And so in that statement, you're saying it's not that people don't gain strength. It's just not that earned strength is often the strength that's needed for survival, not some other kind of superpower, I suppose. Maybe the superpower is in survival. And you also write, the will and wherewithal born out of catastrophe cannot be showcased, glorified, or even reliably observed, because it is subject to constant confiscation, a daily toll that must be paid so that the embattled may continue progressing through their lives. Misfortune may create strength, but some circumstances ensure that those qualities never transcend the misfortune that begot them. Catastrophe creates that which it requires. And that last line is one that I've noted. It gives me chills. And I've said that to myself many times since reading it. Can we examine strength in the way that you have focused on it in the book? And why did you set out to challenge that particular long-held value?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I see it as a two-parter. So to start, I really wanted to kind of confront and interrogate Nietzsche's aphorism because it meant so much to me for a long time. Mm-hmm. Especially as I mentioned in the book, in my youth, in my adolescence, in my 20s, in the first few years after being diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, it was something that was a real source of empowerment, of maybe the romance of self-aggrandizement. It was something that was kind of inspiring and empowering and motivating. But, over time, and as I also talk about in the book, during this constellation therapy session, I gradually became disillusioned with the aphorism. And I slowly came to interrogate it more and more. And over the course of writing the book, as you kind of allude to in those lines and those passages, I do find a much more nuanced idea about what kind of strength comes out of these catastrophic life events. And so ultimately, I don't think that Nietzsche's aphorism is completely incorrect. Mm-hmm. It's just that the way that we've kind of inherited it and interpreted it and sort of the glorification of suffering that it espouses is to me extremely misleading and deceptive. Because although it is my conviction that, when you go through these experiences, you do have greater reserves of strength, of resilience, of fortitude, of wherewithal, whatever term you want to use. The paradox there is that those deeper layers of strength that we are forced to develop in the wake of these types of experiences are absorbed by the experiences themselves. Like catastrophe creates that which it requires. So, I spoke to a lot of parents who lost children, that none of them ultimately became among the central subjects of the book, but I do feel like I learned a lot from them. And they, to me, are a perfect example of this idea that, every day is much more emotionally harrowing for them, since losing a child, in that specific afterlife. But on the outside, they might come across as more emotionally fragile, and maybe even less resilient than they once were. But, internally, they're negotiating and navigating much more than they did before. So in one sense, they have a much deeper reserve of strength and fortitude than they ever had before, but it's not the kind of strength that is easily manifested. It's not something that we can see or observe, or that can be kind of flaunted. It's a much more internal trait that, again, is really not as visible to outside observers.
It's just such an important unveiling, I think, to me, about just the daily toll, as you say, the use of the strength in order to get through a common day, versus it being something that is sort of appreciated on the exterior. And I think, in addition to your story, we have so many people who are dealing with chronic illness or what happens after the catastrophe happens, and how they're dealing with their bodies, and just how much work. And you do such a good job in the book. And I think of Valerie, who puts in these hours every day to sustain any kind of, she's, for the people who haven't read the book, but she is paralyzed, and she puts in so many hours a day just to even prevent a decline in her physical self, and we see, and that's so much behind the scenes. And you already did address the sort of the media and the stories that the media shows us about catastrophe, trauma, tragedy, and provide us with this sort of pat narrative that is about overcoming, right? And the characters featured in TV and movies are often exceptional. And to me, that actually is the opposite of inclusion or representation. When you have the doctor who is somehow, has some issue or something, and yet they are performing beyond the abilities of typical humans. I suppose defenders would say that these stories bring us hope, but you make it clear that an afterlife is a life of continued struggle, and at least a life that is permanently altered. And that can come off as hopeless if we're telling those stories, as you do in the book. But in actuality, you present several other ways that trauma changes our identity, including ones that I would say are positive. And you have different chapters in the book that talk about those. One of them is seeking, one is devotion, one is refinement. Can you talk us through those, or choose one and tell us how you came to pull these threads out of these stories of trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's 8 chapters: diminishment, fortitude, demons, seeking, refinement, vulnerability, devotion, and reinvention. Um, I had a few of them in mind, like in the early stages of my reporting, that were kind of based on my own personal experience. The first few interviews, just kind of an intuitive sense of how these catastrophic events changed our lives. I would say one of the more interesting chapters and therefore ways that people change after these before and after events is refinement. Mm-hmm. So that's one that I would say I really did not expect to include at all before reporting for the book, but after speaking to, over 100 people and kind of deciding on which of these interviewees I was ultimately going to feature in the book, I felt that it was really unavoidable. Like there was an inescapability to including this concept of refinement. And the way that I discussed it in the book is basically a lot of people who go through these types of events need to refine or purify or simplify their lives in order to survive and thrive. Mm-hmm. So like speaking of Valerie, so Valerie, who was in a car accident when she was in her late adolescence, she became paralyzed. Just using her as an example, she enjoyed kind of a rich, vibrant, multifaceted life in high school. But then as I kind of recount over the course of the book, her life ultimately became sort of less multifarious and less multiplex. And she became much more focused on academia, on medieval studies, on focusing, on advancing kind of her incipient career. Mm-hmm. And so, had she not been paralyzed, it's easy to imagine that perhaps her life would have continued along the lines that it possessed during her high school years, where, she had a lot of friendships. She went to parties. She mm-hmm. sort of had a more vivacious life with a wider scope. Yeah. But because of, the traumatic event that she experienced, it really narrowed the scope of her life. And that's kind of her version of refinement. I mean, I think different subjects have different experiences that all fall within the parameters of refinement. But I think in a lot of cases, it's kind of, you need to embrace sort of a more ascetic lifestyle mm-hmm. where you don't really have the same level of freedom that you once did. And so you narrow the scope of your life, you narrow the parameters of your life, and you accept a certain degree of sacrifice because those are just the requirements of kind of the new landscape that catastrophe has forced you to reckon with. Right.
And I think even as we're hearing you say that, like it can feel like sacrifice, and it can feel like focus, and it really depends on, and it can feel like specialty. It can feel like loss. It can feel like refinement, can feel like any of those things. But ultimately it, I suppose, collects the energy that a person has while they're also being, I suppose, drained by their resulting struggle. To really find success in a more directed way, as opposed to, as you say, like a more varied sort of life. So I may have been going a little too far on saying that these are necessarily positive, but I do think that is, you talk a lot about how people are propelled forward and into creating this new identity. And I think refinement does that. But it's not all obviously positive. I mean, the trauma and the tragedy is terrible, but we're talking about the afterlives, and that trauma and hardship also makes us more vulnerable in our afterlives. And that is a chapter in the book about vulnerability and being vulnerable over time. And you write, quote, "The vulnerability of afterlives manifests itself as a heightened exposure to not only concrete physical sequelae. I was like, how do I say that word? Like injury and infirmity, but also social issues like unemployment, marginalization, and poverty. Those leading these lives grapple with an increased susceptibility to future crises, trials that can be traced back to the originative catastrophe. And while I think it could be said that the life stories of the people you include in the book deliberately show how they took control of their identity and made something positive for themselves, even if they had to compromise or refine that original vision, I'm curious why you chose not to include stories of relapse or future struggle. Like were you trying to create sort of guideposts for people who are trying to reframe their identity so that they can propel themselves forward, much like the characters that you have in the book?
So originally, actually, the way I was thinking about structuring the chapters was to include vulnerability earlier, and to kind of end on a more, for lack of a better word, triumphant note with devotion and reinvention. But that felt disingenuous or insincere or not true to experience. So I actually, really made a deliberate choice to include vulnerability later in the book to kind of speak to the fact that, as that passage suggests, our traumas and catastrophes reverberate over the course of our lives, and they have echoes and resonances that could happen, 2, 3, 5, even 10 years later. And, speaking from experience as somebody with a serious chronic illness, the vulnerability shows or demonstrates how in our afterlives aren't stable. They don't have that stability that we would hope for or that we would want, or that, like we were talking about before, mainstream media, pop culture, kind of our absolutes would suggest that we all possess. So I think by including vulnerability later in the book, I wanted to show that there is kind of an instability in afterlives, and things can happen, years down the line that are connected to the originative event, and in fact are a direct or indirect effect of that event. But, it's happening many years later, and it's transforming our identities again. And so I think, vulnerability, it just challenges our idea of linear transformation. The idea that, we're transforming in a linear, one-dimensional way, and we have that kind of agency over our lives.
Right.
So, I think that that vulnerability can really confound and upend or contradict those ideas of linear transformation.
Right. I definitely, my experience with my husband's cancer is very similar. And I was talking to him about your book, and he said, and he was a teacher before he was diagnosed and had his stem cell transplant. And now he is not able to be in a classroom. And that's very similar to what you described for yourself. And the refinement of having to sort of make his life smaller in order to reserve the energies he needs in order to do the things that he needs to do. That all of this echoes, I think anyone who's reading this book is going to, and who has either witnessed it or been close to someone who's gone through something like this, is going to see themselves in that vulnerability. And, but I do want to look at a sort of important subset of the profiles that you include in the book. And that is when you use the word diminishment to describe the first condition to result from catastrophe, I'm going to quote this, an abrupt loss of some or even most of the territory that individuals had once taken as a given in their lives. And the loss of that territory is represented in the stories that you include in the book. As we've talked about, 4 feature a loss of physical or cognitive abilities, but you also include 2 stories about incarceration. And you've mentioned that a couple of times as we've been talking. incarceration as catastrophe, or maybe even a second catastrophe layered upon the first one that caused, the crime or the incident that happened. And you also write how thoroughly Americans had long dismissed the lived experience of incarcerated people, and that dehumanization is almost always a prerequisite for atrocities against them. The inclusions of these stories in the book might surprise some people for a variety of reasons, but because I think we have an uncomfortable relationship with who deserves hardship, right? And who doesn't. We often sigh about bad things happen to good people, or that it's karma, or whatever way that we sort of refer to being surprised that something happened to someone, or thinking that we will be exempt from that because we were good people. And with incarceration, we think those people found guilty of a crime are sort of getting what they deserve. But if you could tell us why you think of it very differently, and how Sean and Jason's stories help us see incarceration or incarcerated people as deserving of the same level of compassion and empathy that good people who are going through trauma deserve.
Yeah, it's definitely a great question. And I did anticipate people being conflicted or having differing viewpoints in terms of whether that's like a worthy subject for before and after events and afterlives. I think to kind of reference something that I mentioned, I believe it's in the introduction. Yeah, we sort of take for granted the idea of retributive justice and the idea that people are getting what they deserve. And there's a reciprocity there that allows us to not think about or not worry about incarceration. We think that, okay, well, these individuals committed a crime and now they're, suffering from a reciprocating equal punishment for that crime. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of sense of equality, that they're getting what they deserve, that there's kind of a cause and effect, I think allows us to not think about people that are incarcerated, or to marginalize them, or to put them out of our minds. Mm-hmm. But, when I began reporting for this book, I don't think I had necessarily a significant amount of background or context or knowledge about incarceration, but I did choose to include it, in the reporting net that I cast. And what I found was that in a lot of cases, not that I'm the arbiter of, the negative effects of the crimes that some of these individuals committed, but ultimately, the amount of suffering that incarcerated people endure behind bars, whether it's through isolation, through PTSD, through exposure to violence, through, dealing with violence personally, I just think there's a certain level of suffering and isolation and trauma that they endure that, to me, measures up to a lot of the other types of catastrophic life events that I explore in the book. And the other reason that it seemed to me to be an eminently worthy topic or category for before and after events is the experiences that people undergo during incarceration really do force them to change their identities. Mm-hmm. Because it's such a unique set of circumstances, in the sense of you're being stripped of everything that once made you who you were. All the markers of identity, whether it's your career, your relationships, your home, your hometown, all of those things that kind of layer on a person to give them a unique, distinctive identity, it's all being stripped away. Mm-hmm. So to me, that was really compelling. And the idea that, this is kind of a slow burning, long-term trauma that completely erases a person's identity. So to me, that felt like it spoke powerfully to the kind of themes that I wanted to address in the book. Mm-hmm. About how tragedy and trauma and catastrophe can kind of rupture or violate our narratives erase our identities and force us to build ourselves back again, in all these different types of ways. So in that sense, it really spoke to some of the major themes of the book.
I'm interested in, I sketched out a question here that I think I'm going to turn a little bit, but I think, obviously the goal, the goal of incarceration is to restrict freedom in order to change a person, right? There's punishment too, and I'm not saying like prison is by default rehabilitating. There are some programs that might do that, but in general, we don't believe that it does. But it is sort of like the implication, other than punishment or keeping someone out of society, is that somehow it will affect some kind of change on this person. And I think that when we talk about other ways that we are restricted after trauma, whether it's paralysis, whether it's any other kind of lack of freedoms. And I was toying with this idea of freedom. And if freedom is the thing that is the common factor of what each person in this book and the people who go through these traumas have restricted in their lives. And we're just sort of hardwired to want as much freedom as possible. And when that freedom is constrained, we have to adapt to whatever literal or figurative box that we are in. But I think what's more interesting about that is something that you said a little earlier about agency and how much agency we have in our lives. And one of the lines that you write is about your own situation is, I began to feel that I was suspended between the person I was before I got sick and whatever person this catastrophe was going to change me into. And the way that is phrased, that there is, there's an inherent passivity to that change is being done to you, that you are going to be afflicted by something out of your control. And I'm really interested in, you don't spend a lot of time in the book talking about, or even the people that you interviewed talk about being a victim at all, or victimhood, or trying to get around a feeling of victimhood. But instead, you're really talking, I think, about agency within the freedom constraints that we are all given. Would that be correct in saying that this really is a book about taking the agency that is available to us?
Yeah, I think you could definitely look at it like that. I really liked what you said about freedom. I think that really is a really compelling way to kind of unify all the narratives, including my own. And it does kind of resonate with some of the passages where I juxtapose people who haven't experienced catastrophic life events with those who have. If you haven't been through these types of experiences, you do have a certain level of absolute freedom. Your cognition, your body, your finances, your status, all of these things are completely uninhibited. And you're able to enjoy absolute freedom. And that's something that we romanticize and glorify. And really, obviously, freedom is like one of the chief overarching ideals in America. And I think there is like a sort of a freedom in terms of our identity that, many of us enjoy and thrive off of. And I think that the subjects in this book, like you said, they all have had that freedom inhibited or compromised in some way, whether it's, literally being incarcerated, being paralyzed, experiencing limb loss, experiencing blindness, having our cognition or cognitive faculties compromised in some way. I think a lot of it really can be boiled down to a loss of freedom. Right. And that loss of freedom then forces us to, as you say, address our lives and understand, well, what does our agency look like now? Because it's really easy to, to seize one's agency if none of your faculties or opportunities have been grievously compromised by a catastrophic life event. That type of agency is easy to understand. It's transparent and clear. I think the agency that these subjects are trying to discover over the course of the book is a much more difficult one because, it's kind of immersed in their compromised freedoms. And so, if you looked at each subject, I think, again, to go back to Valerie as one example, I think she learned over the course of her 20s that, for her greatest agency existed in her pursuit of medieval studies and academia and becoming a scholar. That's where she felt like she could kind of activate her agency in a way where maybe she wasn't able to in all these other theaters of her life.
Right.
So, I think it's definitely a more kind of narrow, nuanced conception of agency that we have to come to terms with. But I hadn't thought about it like that. I think it's a really great insight, the idea that all of these subjects in different ways are discovering what aspect of their agency still exists after these catastrophic life events.
Yeah. I think that, we can go in so many different directions. I actually want to focus on one fairly small chapter that you have included, that is stories we tell ourselves. And I was really fascinated by this one as well. You talk about you yourself having consciously tried to tie two of your traumas together in a sort of karmic cause and effect. When you were young, you caused a violent car accident that left you and a friend actually unharmed. But then later in life, you received your diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, and you did some amount of work trying to tie those two things subjectively tie those things together. And when we experience trauma, we so often want an answer to the question, why me? That we create these, as you say, these subjective narratives to give us an answer that is unanswerable. And I'm curious that whether we say so many of these aphorisms that we've already been talking a little bit about, like God only gives us what we can handle, or those kinds of things another popular one that people use is, not going to be able to think about it, but basically like whatever happened was supposed to happen, that things worked out the way that they were supposed to. And I think that I'm curious about like this need to craft some type of subjective narrative to provide an answer, and to sort of attach that tail to the donkey and say, this is why this happened to me.
Yeah, I think that stories we tell ourselves, that sort of subsection, that interlude, just speaks to, I think, how much I wanted to graft meaning onto my chronic fatigue syndrome. Even if it was sort of a masochistic meaning, even if I was subjectively deducing that I actually deserve this disabling chronic condition, which, seems like something somebody wouldn't want. We don't want to feel guilt. We don't want to feel remorse. We don't want to feel responsible for some atrocity or something awful happening to us. You would think. But in my experience and kind of in the ways that I explore that subjectivity in that section, I think it can be gratifying to imbue some meaning into these types of experiences, even if that meaning is, well, maybe our misdeeds or our moral imperfections or flaws earlier in life somehow sowed the seeds for this event to take place. And I kind of go into touch a little bit on how that type of logic, this magical cause and effect, exists in fiction, in movies. It's kind of omnipresent in culture, even though we don't really consciously realize it.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that we have a really hard time accepting a meaningless event.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're hardwired in some way to ascribe meaning to everything.
Mm-hmm.
So even if it's extremely subjective and illogical, there's that sort of pull or that compulsion to attribute meaning to all different types of, well, especially to the most defining events in our lives.
Right.
And so for me, you know, those two events kind of created kind of this equilibrium in my life, and they sort of seem to kind of resonate with each other, even though objectively I understand that they're completely unrelated and not, there's no logical causal relationship between them. It felt to me like it was a way of there being some kind of purpose behind this this diagnosis.
What I really liked about that is that you didn't actually spend time in that interlude, as you called it, which is perfect, either judging yourself or judging anyone who might need that. It actually seemed, you know, that it was, as you said, it was a sort of it's magical thinking that harkens back to, you know, the Joan Didion book, The Year of Magical Thinking. And just this feeling that, you know, if we need stories, we can rely on stories. And speaking of stories, we only have a few minutes left. If that seems incredible, that we have about 4 minutes. And I had other questions for you. I had questions about literature. I had all these things, but I want to close with something that has really touched me in the book. And it's actually at the end of the introduction. You tell us you write the following. This is a quote, the final paragraph of the introduction. Of the course we take through life, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem wrote, "The dragon sits by the side of the road, watching those who pass. Beware lest he devour you. We go to the Father of souls, but it is necessary to pass by the dragon." And then you extrapolate, those people leading afterlives have passed by the dragon, faced down its scalding plumes of flame and jackknife teeth and scythe-like claws, and the confrontation could not have done anything less than change them forever. And that last line is another line that gives me chills, that speaks so directly to my experience. And I felt like throughout the book and in that line and so many others I've talked about, I felt like you recognized and paid respect to the biography of my life, my having faced down the dragon and come out changed. And it's rare to feel that. And so I thank you for that. And I know that everyone who reads this book will feel similarly seen and perhaps even freed to claim the identity that their struggle has compelled them to become. And so I thank you, Mike, for this book, for joining us today. And I encourage everyone to buy a copy of the book for themselves, but also anyone you know who may be struggling with trauma and the resulting transition between selves. It is a true gift. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Mike. And I hope that so many people are changed by what you wrote in this book, like I feel like I have been.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really great conversation. And I really appreciate your saying that.
Have a great night.
All right, you too. Take care.
Good night from Boswell. And there's a link in the Good Night from Boswell. There's a link to buy your copy of What Doesn't Kill Us Makes Us in the chat there. If you want to click that now, it'll pop up. We will have a recording of this. Mike, Sally, thank you from Boswell, and thank you all.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.